little girl, I wanted to make things happen. I wanted to organize all my friends in the neighborhood to develop a theater production. I wanted to bring together neighbors to clean up litter in our parks. I wanted to capture the stories and the wisdom of the older people who are in our community. And everywhere I was, I wanted to change something and kind of make it better if I could. And by the time I was 16, 17, my mom and dad declared that I was the instigator in chief in our family, which meant I was the CIO, the chief instigation officer for my family. And now, several years later, I actually am designing programs, and I'm going to share with you some of the experiments and insights and failures and successes of trying to create a school condition and context in which students can make things happen. At the core of my work is this principle that a 21st century education needs to be more than just delivering a disciplinary knowledge or even a liberal arts education. Alongside that, we need to be developing students' creative capacity to be problem solvers in their global and local communities and to be innovators in their field. So as we think about what that is going to look like, I started to think about what is the outcome? What is the outcome that we're looking for? Are we trying to create students who are going to be lone creative geniuses? Well, maybe not. Actually, we want to develop students who can harness collective creativity, right? And who can be fluent in kind of harnessing the ideas of others. And I also wanted to think about, well, what is the workplace going to look like? What is your career structure going to look like when you graduate, when our students graduate? Well, this is the future. It's kind of messy and it's kind of ugly, and it's very different than what some of us as professors have been engaging in, right? So the future, for many of you who are engaged who will be in the creative workforce, is really about short-term emergent projects. You're going to hop from company to company, to project. You're going to be working and navigating in projects that bring together experts and funders and ideas from across disciplines, from across organizations, from across cultures. How do we prepare you for that? How do we get you ready to harness multidisciplinary expertise, to harness collective creativity, to navigate this new economy? And so I started to try to look out there and try to say, well, who's doing this work? Who's already existing, kind of doing this kind of career, this creative career? Producers. So let me share a little bit about producers. So I've had the great fortune to study music producers in Nashville. This is Will Kimbrough, singer-songwriter. And producers are all about taking that 3 chords and the truth and turning it into this. Nashville, glamour, that high production value. And I spend a lot of time studying music producers because they are at the nexus, the hub of creative production, all the way from bringing ideas, that initial raw song, and trying to find the right pairing with the right artist, the right match, finding funders, big name labels, powerful publishers who are maybe not willing to give up songs, maybe not willing to give up distribution and funding for a high-risk product, right? Who knows what's going to work? What's going to be a hit? The producers also have to go through this process of trying to find who's going to be on their team. Who are the session players? Who are the electrical guitar, the bass guitarist, the lead session player, the fiddle player, the drummer, the pianist, who's going to make that magic happen in a short time frame, under lots of pressure and lots of intensity? And then how can they generate ideas when everyone has competing ideas about what quality is, what will make a hit? Who's in charge? Who's the expert? Who should be able to be in control of the decisions and where that creative product is going? And how do you make that magic happen? There's no formula. This is the life of the producer. And they have to be able to generate ideas and get everyone to kind of create ideas, but they also have to manage this much more difficult task of winnowing and editing and saying no to people who need to stay committed on their projects. It's a very, very difficult balance. So where else do we find producers? Well, in film, right? That's kind of an obvious thing. Again, bringing and harnessing expertise. But we also find producers are artists who are trying to make change in their communities. They're the organizers of this conference, right? Who are trying to produce a new event, a new concept for Furnham and a new conversation. is for deans of schools who are trying to reinvent what education can be. These are all producers. This is the model. As I think about producers, and I'm thinking about how do we build an educational environment that'll help students become producers and develop that creative capacity to produce novel ideas and solve problems, I want to make sure that we think about the entire creative arc, from idea generation and how do you garner resources, all the way through ideation and prototyping, and all the way through to implementation. Now, as you look at this, we've talked a lot, people who talk about creative careers focus on these kind of networked environments. And what I want you to focus on here is not necessarily the network, although that's very interesting, right? So all these people, they're trying to bring together different interests, different goals, different perspectives on what's quality, where we should be going, how we should do things. But the work of the producer is actually brokering all these relationships. It's that work of managing the relationships across all the parties and keeping everyone involved and engaged that's really the work that I think we need to develop and build into our educational system. So in my work at Vanderbilt, I've built several programs that are focused on building the creative capacities of students. And the question is, well, what are those? And the first is the one that we all think of when we think of creativity and innovation, that ability to invent and imagine. Brainstorming, that idea to broker ideas from different disciplines, different thought worlds, that liberal arts education, right? That helps us gain new insight into one area and draw it from another. Design thinking, phenomenal for helping us invent and imagine through user-centered design. But oftentimes when we think about creativity and innovation, this is where we stop. And this is just part of the story. You can have that great idea, but unless you have the expressive agility, that ability to tell your story, to pitch your ideas, to get people engaged, it's not going to go anywhere. So the second capacity is that expressive agility to tell your stories, pitch your ideas in compelling ways using a range of media. The third key capacity that I want all of us to nurture in our students is the ability to negotiate collective creativity. And negotiation is an interesting word, right? Because we always think of collaboration. Wonderful, positive, that's what we need in order to develop creative products. Well, in fact, creative process is much messier than that, right? We have different interests. People have different perceptions of what the reality is, different interpretations. And so it requires considerable, this key is in the empathic listening, to try to understand what are those underlying interests that people have. How do I jointly solve problems and bring people into a collective problem-solving process? That's what negotiation is all about. And when running up against true obstacles, how do I pivot, right? So we found that entrepreneurs, right, might pivot hundreds of times in their idea as they go from ideation to implementation. Now, for me, I think this navigate implementation is such a key part of the conversation. I've been so impressed with my fellow speakers today who've all been talking about not only generating the ideas, but actually implementing them, right? And that's where the real key is for all of you to feel engaged and that you're actually making an impact. It's also very, very complicated, right? So I think it's interesting we talk about innovation, we talk about creativity. A lot of the projects, a lot of the work that you're going to be committing yourselves to are actually change initiatives. And once you start talking about change, you start talking about power. And you start talking about the status quo and the stickiness of systems and people who don't want change. And so in terms of navigating implementation, I want all of you to have exposure to systems thinking and understanding who are the stakeholders, what's at play for everybody, and how do you build coalitions and strategically bring people in to your endeavor, and strategically think about timing and how you present your ideas to them to be able to implement it successfully. Finally, I feel like the key that runs through all the work of producing collective creative ideas is managing ambiguity. And not only having a tolerance for it, but actually being facile with managing it as both constraint and a resource in the collective creative process. And so a lot of that is actually just being comfortable with working out of your comfort zone, right? So how often do we actually encourage students? We talk a lot about risk and failure, but actually just working in an entirely different context than we feel like we're an expert in. Okay, so these are the 5 capacities that are kind of at the core of being a producer and kind of producing collective creative projects. For me, the question is, well, how do we build these creative capacities in higher ed? So I thought I had the most fabulous idea. I decided I would do what I call the Creative Practice Boot Camp. And what I would do is I would have this one-day event, and I'd bring in all these amazing experts from graphic facilitation into design school for design thinking, habits of creative problem solving, storytellers, improvisation, Second City, faculty, staff, students, come on, right? So there's over 600 slots. I didn't know if anyone would come, right? It was for free, but unbelievably, in 5 hours, it sold out. It was amazing. I mean, this was untapped need in higher education in this context. In 2002, I mixed it up a little bit more. We brought in data visualization and some other experts. Again, sold out. And as I was thinking about it, I'm like, wow, incredibly successful. But I realized this was not enough, right? So what I had provided people was exposure to creative practice, tools, techniques. But what I really wanted was to develop their fluency in creative practice. So when you're going off, I hope many of you have the opportunity to travel abroad, and you'll either take a class or maybe you'll have one of those phrase books, right, to prepare yourself for going into another culture. And you'll have your phrases, and the key is the difference between having some phrases that you know and actually having the fluency to know when to apply them, the subtleties of their use, knowing when and how and who with whom you should use which phrases, which accent. And that is what I want in terms of thinking about building creative capacity on campus. I want fluency. How do you move to that? Well, practice, right? If you want to be a great athlete, you practice. You go to practice. Our educational systems support that. If you want to be a virtuoso musician, practice, rehearsals. Do we have that for creative practice? That's the question. So how do you raise creativity up to that same level as athletics or music or these other fields in which we want to foster fluency? So what does it take for creative practice? Well, I suggest that we need to do student-centered design of the educational process and experience around creative practice. Okay, so what does that look like? So that means focusing on the student experience from your freshman orientation all the way to graduation and beyond as alumni, and think about all the opportunities, all the touch points, all those critical moments that could be moments to foster and develop your creative practice. So what you typically have, in our typical higher ed situation now is, you get to take kind of above the line, if you can imagine, that's kind of curricular experiences. You have that creative writing class. Fantastic. You also have like a couple, you worked on an amazing play, you kind of launched an event, and here's what everyone holds their hat on, that capstone course, right? It's integrating all your ideas, you get to put your ideas into practice. But this is not enough to develop fluency. What I suggest is that we need to have a constellation of experiences, curricular and extracurricular, in the classroom, out of the classroom, all designed to develop your creative practice. So this is what I've been trying to provoke and experiment with at Vanderbilt, and I'm just going to run through some of our ideas, and I suggest just see what might work here at Furman. What do you want to do when you think about your educational experience? So the first thing I worked on in collaboration with some other faculty members and students was developing a proposed minor in creative enterprise and public leadership. This idea is that there's actually theory, there's practice of creativity and innovation, design thinking that can be learned, and that the minor would be available to all majors to augment their major experience. We tried to find wiggle room within the existing kind of course structure to create interdisciplinary classes. We had this great creativity and crisis class where we took on how do you take a creative approach to healthcare, to the environment, to poverty. And we have an innovation grant program where we encourage faculty who are interested to think about their classes. Here's a soul food as superfood, right? Reconsidering soul food as a superfood. ones that are focused on creative practice. I also have started the CURB Scholarship Program in Creative Enterprise and Public Leadership. And this is a 4-year scholarship program, the first of its kind in the country, that's focused on creativity and innovation for the public good. And we meet weekly. I let the students curate it. So we've had paper engineers come, so you can kind of think about, like, how do we play with paper in different ways? Lots of different creative, kind of just immersion in creative practice. But we also have kind of larger projects that we engage in as well. So for example, we had the students, we worked with a faculty member and an artist to develop a Kickstarter campaign that the students designed themselves. They did all the production of it to raise money for a creative project to fight diabetes in African American communities. And all of the scholars over 4 years had the chance to develop and are supported as they develop their legacy project, their creative enterprise and public leadership and legacy project for the campus and the community. What I tell students and what I warn them is that they're routinely and weekly going to be pushed out of their comfort zone. So here, this was a project runway. We just kind of used it with Foundware. You can see Maria, she's the second to the left. She's a public policy major, and she is wearing an outfit made out of Chinese, takeout boxes. I have an economist, I have a neuroscientist here. None of them have ever done Project Runway. They just looked at me and said, are you crazy? But this is what I do on a weekly basis so that they can get kind of comfortable and tolerant and fluent in handling ambiguous situations and working out of their comfort zone. Okay, so if we think about kind of these curricular innovations, how do we foster creative practice outside of the classroom? Well, for me, the key is to develop a community of catalysts or producers. I cannot do this all alone. And I feel like in terms of the Instigator, I go around campus and I kind of whisper to people, would you be interested in thinking about, changing your events, your programs, whatever it is, to kind of foster creative practice? I love doing that, especially when I get to see the twinkle in their eyes and like, wow, I can actually, transform what I've been doing for 10 years and do something different with it. So first year orientation has become a noticing exercise. We invite students to notice campus and notice serendipitous moments, cool design. Imagine if this is how you saw campus the very first day you arrived. It has had meaningful impact on all of our students who see school in a different way. And they also kind of curated the pictures to do a stump the professors to see if they could find and identify where these places were on campus. We have speed dating events, so instead of just your typical mixer, we kind of do these generative, we have speed dating. You have 7 minutes to try to generate some new cool ideas with people and share your interests with other people. We do this with faculty, staff, students, and we mix between faculty and students and staff all together to generate ideas and cool collaborations. I think one of the things that's really interesting is how many of you know what your faculty members or your dean or the president, what is their creative practice? Why is that not part of the conversation? So we also had initiatives to kind of reveal people's and illuminate people's creative shadow identities. We think about space. Furman has a gorgeous campus. Could you erect a graffiti wall, invite people to leave their creative signature? Could you think about actually utilizing the space as creative palette? What cross-campus initiatives could you develop that are focused on these different capacities? So I started with partners all around campus, this story booth. We were all interested in stories and helping faculty, staff, and students develop the capacity to tell their stories, whether long or short, to respond to things like the first time they voted in an election. So we have this mobile story booth. It's highly customized. It can be deployed like all over campus, in the dining hall, in the theater, in classroom, all to provide this outlet as well as the symbol that storytelling is so important on our campus. And all through this, I just want to let you know, I've invited students to actually be some of our lead designers, because you have such great insights and ideas for what we could be doing. And so, for example, a mechanical engineering design team has actually reinvented kind of the outer shell for a video booth. So this is and it can all be folded up, kind of origami style. And this will be the outer shell of our booth going forward. So, as a parting note, it's a mystery when you're making history. This is my team. We have fun while we're doing this. And we kind of did approach of learn from our experiments and what can we share with others. And so I just encourage you as you think about reimagining higher education, think about student-centered design around fostering creative practice. Thank you so much.